In the first chapter, Guénon lays the foundational principles for his critique of the modern world by establishing the fundamental distinction between quality and quantity. He posits them as complementary terms, representing the first of all cosmic dualities. At their most universal level, quality and quantity correspond to the universal principles of essence and substance, respectively. In the Hindu doctrine, this duality is known as Purusha and Prakriti. These terms act as the two poles of all manifestation, and their relationship can be observed at various levels within universal existence, from the cosmos as a whole to individual beings and their different states. Guénon connects these concepts to scholastic philosophy, where essence and substance are equated with form and matter, although he prefers to avoid these latter terms due to linguistic inaccuracies and their modern, often equivocal, usage. He also notes the correspondence with the Hindu terms nama form/essence and rupa matter/substance in relation to individual beings, and Aristotle's act and potency. Pure act and pure potency are presented as equivalents of universal essence and substance, which cannot exist anywhere in manifestation. Crucially for the book's overarching theme, Guénon explains that in our particular world, defined by its specific conditions, these two principles appear as quality and quantity. Quality, representing the superior principle or essence, is described as the principial synthesis of all the attributes that belong to a being and make that being what it is. It is not confined to our world and can be universalized, akin to the attributes of God. Guénon highlights Aristotle's eidos, which means both form and species, as being purely qualitative and innumerable, in the sense of being independent of quantity, indivisible, and entire in every individual of a species. He further links eidos to Plato's ideas, which are also essences and represent the qualitative side of manifestation. The Pythagorean numbers, often mistakenly understood quantitatively by moderns, are presented as purely qualitative. Quantity, on the other hand, is explicitly linked to the substantial side of manifestation in our world. Guénon cites St. Thomas Aquinas' statement that numerus stat ex parte materiae, number stands on the side of matter, to emphasize this connection. He clarifies that materia in the scholastic sense is substance and not the matter of modern physics, which is a much later and more confused concept. Unlike quality, quantity is strictly tied to the specific conditions of our world. In summary, Chapter 1 establishes that while quality and quantity are complementary, they exist at different hierarchical levels. Quality pertains to the essential, higher, and universal aspects of being, while quantity relates to the substantial, lower, and particular conditions of our manifested world. This distinction sets the stage for Guénon's argument that the modern world's characteristic reduction of everything to a quantitative point of view represents a fundamental descent and deviation from true reality. In Chapter 2, Materia Signata Quantitate, Guénon delves deeper into the concept of substance, materia, and its profound connection to quantity, particularly as understood in the context of scholastic philosophy, while simultaneously critiquing modern scientific views. This chapter is crucial for understanding the fundamental descent towards quantity that for Guénon defines the modern world. Guénon begins by clarifying that the scholastic materia should in no way be confused with the matter of modern physicists. He aligns materia with Aristotle's Heil and the Hindu Prakriti, presenting it as the passive support of all manifestation and pure potentiality. He distinguishes between materia prima, universal substance, pure potentiality, absolutely indistinguishable and unintelligible, and materia secunda, relative substance, constituting the potential side of a specific world or being. Crucially, he asserts that explanation of things must be sought on the essential side, not the substantial side, emphasizing that universal substance is fundamentally unintelligible because there is nothing in it to be known. This immediately highlights a core failing of modern science, which attempts to explain everything from the substantial side. He criticizes modern physics for endowing its matter with properties, thereby making it a materia secunda, as pure potentiality would have no properties, and in doing so creating an insoluble contradiction by simultaneously calling it inert. Guénon argues that modern physicists, in their attempt to reduce quality to quantity, have ended up confusing the two and attributing quality to matter itself, ultimately assigning all reality to matter, a stance he terms materialism. He views this as an aberration, a reduction of the higher to the lower, where the greater is claimed to be derived from the lesser. The central point of the chapter is the scholastic definition of our world's materia secunda as materia signata quantitate, matter signed by quantity. This means that for our particular world, quantity, not quality, is inherent in its substantial side. Quantity is presented as one of the very conditions of existence in the sensible or corporeal world, the most exclusive to it, serving as its basic or fundamental condition. However, Guénon warns against attributing to it an importance of a higher order, stressing that quantity by itself explains nothing and is merely a necessary presupposition situated at the lowest level. Guénon then considers the different modes of quantity: discontinuous quantity, number, and continuous quantity, spatial and temporal magnitudes. He points out Descartes' error in defining matter purely in terms of extension, a continuous quantity, suggesting that Descartes' matter is an early example of modern physics' confused concept. Instead, Guénon, aligning with St. Thomas Aquinas' statement, numerus stat ex parte materiae, number stands on the side of matter, posits number as the proper representation of pure quantity and the substantial basis of our world. He notes that atomistic theories, by introducing discontinuity, implicitly move closer to the nature of number. Other modes of quantity, like space and time, are merely derived from number and are always more or less mixed with quality. Modern science, in its pursuit of an exclusively quantitative understanding, reduces these concepts to entirely empty notions without contact with reality, exemplifying the degeneration of traditional conceptions into profane ones. In essence, Chapter 2 establishes that while quantity is the foundational and substantial aspect of our manifested world, particularly in the form of number, it is the lowest principle. The modern world's obsession with reducing everything to this quantitative perspective, exemplified by Cartesian mechanism and materialism, is seen as a profound misunderstanding and a descent from true qualitative reality. This lays the groundwork for Guénon's continued critique of modernity's abandonment of higher principles in favor of a diminished, quantitative view of existence. In Chapter 3, Measure and Manifestation, Guénon continues to build upon the foundational distinction between quality and quantity by examining the concept of measure in its traditional, profound sense, contrasting it sharply with modern, purely quantitative interpretations. This chapter further elucidates how the substantial aspect of manifestation in our world is characterized not by quality, but by quantity, and particularly by the act of measurement. Guénon begins by reaffirming his preference for the term substance, or materia in the scholastic sense, aligning with Aristotle's Heil and Hindu Prakriti over the modern physicist's matter, due to the latter's inherent confusions and lack of essential meaning in traditional doctrines. He highlights that the modern idea of matter is a recent construct, signifying a highly particularized and ultimately insufficient way of viewing reality. A pivotal point in the chapter is the etymological connection of materia to mater, mother, and meteri to measure. The link to mater underscores substance's role as the passive, feminine, maternal principle in relation to manifestation, complementing the active, masculine, paternal principle, purusha, essence. More significantly, the relation to meteri introduces the concept of measure as fundamental. Guénon cites Ananda K. Kumaraswamy, who states that the Sanskrit word matra, literally measure, is the etymological equivalent of materia. However, this measure is not the physicist's matter, but rather the possibilities of manifestation inherent in the spirit, atma. This immediately elevates measure beyond a mere quantitative assessment, linking it to the potentiality and determination of existence itself. The idea of measure is presented as intimately connected with manifestation and order, Rita, a concept pervasive in all traditional doctrines. The universe, cosmos, etymologically signifying order brought forth from chaos, the indefinite, is a production of order assimilated in traditions to an illumination, e.g. fiat lux. In this context, chaos is the potentiality or the substantial side of the world, described as the tenebrous pole of existence, while essence is the luminous pole that illuminates chaos to extract cosmos. Measure, then, is directly involved in this process of actualization and definition. Guénon explains that measure, in its literal sense, is primarily concerned with continuous quantity, such as spatial and temporal magnitudes. However, he reiterates from Chapter 2 that continuous quantity is only a derived mode stemming from discontinuous quantity, which is number. He notes the inherent imperfection when applying discontinuous number to continuous magnitudes, leading to inadequacy in numerical expression. Crucially, Guénon emphasizes that quantity is not that which is measured, but that by which things are measured. This positions quantity as a tool or a condition, not the ultimate reality of what is being measured. He draws an inverse analogy between the relation of measure to number and the relation of manifestation to its essential principle. This traditional understanding of measure is deeply embedded in the sacred geometry of antiquity. Guénon references Plato's statement that God geometrizes always, ai theos geometre, implying a divine activity in ordering the cosmos. This activity, symbolized by the compass and square, represents the qualitative ordering of the world by the great architect of the universe, Vishvakarma in Hindu tradition, rather than a mere quantitative calculation. Geometry, in this traditional sense, is essentially qualitative, allowing for the representation of higher realities. In sum, Chapter 3 establishes that measure, while appearing as a quantitative aspect in our world, materia signata quantitate, carries a profound qualitative significance rooted in cosmic order and essential principles. The modern reduction of measure to a purely quantitative and often empty notion signifies a fundamental degeneration from traditional understanding. This lays the groundwork for Guénon's subsequent critique of how the modern world, by losing sight of this deeper meaning, is increasingly enveloped in a diminished and fragmented reality. In Chapter 4, Spatial Quantity and Qualified Space, Guénon continues his critique of modern scientific thought by demonstrating the inherent limitations of reducing spatial concepts to mere quantity. He argues that space, particularly in its traditional understanding, possesses a qualitative dimension that modern Cartesian-influenced physics and geometry systematically overlook or deny. Guénon begins by asserting that extension is not purely a mode of quantity. He challenges Descartes' definition of matter solely in terms of extension, highlighting its insufficiency. If space were purely quantitative, it would be entirely homogeneous, with its parts indistinguishable except by size, effectively making it a container without content. Guénon argues that such an empty concept cannot have an independent existence in manifestation, as existence always requires both container and content. He points out the contradiction in Cartesian physics. If bodies are merely extension and their properties are modifications of extension, these properties must somehow be inherent in extension itself, which contradicts the idea of extension as lacking any qualitative elements. This attempt to extract the greater from the lesser is seen as an absurdity. A central tenet of the chapter is that space is not homogeneous but qualified by qualitative determinations. Guénon introduces situation as a spatial determination distinct from mere size. While reductionists might define situation by distances, a quantity, Guénon emphasizes that the direction along which distance is measured is an equally effective and purely spatial element. Since direction cannot be indifferent in a truly effective spatial determination, and yet a purely quantitative space would be directionally homogeneous, it follows that there must be something qualitative in the very nature of space. This leads to the concept of qualified space as the true, real space, in contrast to homogeneous space, which is presented as a mere virtuality. Guénon extends this argument to geometry, differentiating between traditional and profane modern approaches. Even in elementary profane geometry, the shape of figures cannot be reduced to quantity. A triangle and a square of equal area are merely equivalent in size, but their distinct shapes represent a qualitative difference. He cites Leibniz's distinction, equalia sunt ejusdem quantitatis, similia sunt ejusdem qualitatis. Things of the same quantity are equal. Things of the same quality are similar to underscore this point. The theory of similar figures, defined exclusively by shape and independent of size, provides further evidence for the qualitative order in geometry. Traditionally, geometry was essentially qualitative, allowing for the representation of higher realities, often tied to sacred geometry. The requirement for space to be effectively realized and measured necessitates its relation to a defined assemblage of directions, often symbolized as radii emanating from a center, forming a three-dimensional cross. This symbolism reflects the idea that such qualitative ordering is essential for the cosmos, as expressed in Plato's saying, God geometrizes always, ai theos geometrae. Modern science, by contrast, reduces concepts of space and time to entirely empty notions, without contact with reality in its exclusive pursuit of quantitative understanding. Ultimately, Chapter 4 reinforces the idea that space, alongside time, is a condition defining corporeal existence, but these conditions are not matter itself. The ongoing solidification of the world, a theme further developed later in the book, and the qualitative diminution associated with it make it appear that way, allowing for modern man's exclusively quantitative understanding and manipulation of the environment. Guénon suggests that a restoration of the study of spatial directions could help recover the lost, profound meaning of geometry. In Chapter 5, The Qualitative Determinations of Time, Guénon delves into the nature of time, arguing that, much like space, it possesses qualitative aspects that are disregarded by modern, purely quantitative interpretations. He challenges the modern scientific understanding that reduces time to an entirely empty notion. Guénon begins by noting that while both temporal and spatial magnitudes involve continuous quantity, time is even less purely quantitative than space. He dismisses Descartes' concept of time as discontinuous instants, which would necessitate a constant repetition of creation. A key distinction he makes is that time cannot be measured directly, unlike space. Instead, time is measured indirectly by relating it to space through the intermediary of movement, such as the space covered over a duration. This inherent indirectness already suggests that time is not a purely quantitative entity. The chapter further emphasizes the qualitative nature of time by linking it to phenomena beyond the corporeal. Guénon argues that mental phenomena, which are developed in time but lack a spatial character, are nearer to the essence, the superior principle, than corporeal phenomena. Since time conditions these subtle manifestations, its nature must be more qualitative than that of space. Consequently, he critiques psychophysiologists who attempt to quantify mental phenomena, seeing such efforts as an absurd idea and representing the fullest development of the modern scientific aberration. Just as empty space has no effective existence, neither does empty time. Real time, like real space, is qualified by events and determinations. Guénon asserts that it is all the more right to speak of qualified time than of qualified space, implying fewer quantitative and more qualitative determinations in time. He points out that durations, even if quantitatively equal, are not truly equivalent if they are filled by totally different sequences of events. a fact recognized in everyday mental appreciation. The modern mathematical representation of time as a uniform straight line is described as a falsified oversimplification, a characteristic of the modern spirit's tendency to reduce everything to quantity. In contrast, traditional conceptions of time are cyclical, involving qualified time. Guénon highlights the correlation between the qualitative determinations of time and space, exemplified by the annual cycle where the 4 seasons correspond to the 4 cardinal points. A significant consequence of this qualitative understanding of time relates to the speed of events within a cycle. This speed is dependent on the qualitative phases of the cycle, and thus is of a qualitative rather than of a quantitative order. As the cycle approaches its end, events unfold with increasing speed, a progressive contraction of duration, analogous to the acceleration of falling heavy bodies. This descending movement of manifestation moves away from the essential pole and towards the substantial pole, causing all things to become progressively less qualitative and an increasingly quantitative aspect. This implies a real modification of the environment itself, making it more amenable to quantitative understanding and manipulation. Modern science, being a product of these special conditions, is inherently limited in its ability to conceive of different conditions. Finally, Guénon notes that due to cyclical laws, the past and future are in analogical correspondence, meaning that previsions founded on the qualitative determinations of time do not have a divinatory character, but are based on the intrinsic nature of the cycle. This sets the stage for a deeper understanding of the world's progressive solidification and the unique characteristics of the modern era. In Chapter 6, The Principle of Individuation, Guénon examines the scholastic concept of principium individuationis, principle of individuation, to further articulate his critique of the modern world's reduction of reality to quantity. He argues that this scholastic principle, when properly understood, clarifies the role of quantity in distinguishing individual beings and highlights the problematic implications of the modern obsession with quantitative uniformity. Guénon begins by noting that the scholastics identified materia substance as the principium individuationis. This means that within a species it is the substantial aspect, rather than the essential form, that differentiates one individual from another. To avoid linguistic confusion, Guénon clarifies that while scholastics used form, Greek eidos, to denote specific nature or essence, he will generally use form in its ordinary sense, which for corporeal existence is combined with space. He emphasizes that specific nature is of a purely qualitative order and independent of quantity, being indivisible and entire in every individual belonging to the species. The real question of the principium individuationis for the scholastics was not what defines a state of existence as individual, but rather what determination is added to a common specific nature to make individuals distinct beings. This determination, they asserted, is related to materia, which St. Thomas Aquinas specifically defined as materia signata quantitate, matter designated by quantity. Thus, quantity appears distinctly as a principle of separativity. Individuals are incorporated, and their distinction within a species is quantitative. Guénon contrasts this with the notion of species itself, which is exclusively qualitative and innumerable, meaning it is independent of the number of individuals it contains. He stresses that a species should not be confused with a collectivity, which is a purely quantitative, arithmetical sum of individuals. The modern confusion between the general and the collective is attributed to the prevailing tendency to reduce everything to quantity. Guénon then posits that the predominance of quantity over quality in individuals increases as they approach a state of being mere individuals and nothing more, leading to greater separation but less qualitative differentiation. This progressive uniformization aims to suppress qualitative distinctions and turn individuals into something as nearly as possible like mere machines. He explicitly states that this is not true unification, but its exact opposite, a caricature of unity, reflecting the inverse analogy between principial unity and the numerical units of pure quantity. This tendency pushes beings towards the lowest, or infrahuman level, where pure quantity resides beneath all corporeal manifestation. Modern society, with its democratic and egalitarian conceptions, actively promotes this uniformity. Education, for instance, is designed to impose a uniform standard which, while unable to confer qualities, is very well fitted to suppress in everyone all possibilities above the common level. Modern industry, with its focus on mass production and interchangeable numerical units, further exemplifies this triumph of quantity and uniformity. The products of industry and even proposed dwellings are designed to eliminate qualitative differences, reducing human beings to automatons. Ultimately, this process of solidification and the growing predominance of quantity lead to the individual being reduced to his substantial aspect, known in Hindu doctrine as rupa, becoming scarcely more than a body without a soul. The qualitative essential aspect, nama, almost disappears, rendering the individual truly anonymous in an inferior sense, lost in the confusion of quantitative multiplicity rather than a fusion in principial unity. This trajectory, by reducing the individual to a state akin to the physicists' imagined atoms, deprived of all quality, represents a descent towards dissolution. Guénon links this qualitative diminution in human beings to the broader cosmic conditions of the cyclical descent, where the environment itself undergoes a qualitative diminution, allowing a firmer hold to everything that springs from quantity. In Chapter 7, Uniformity Against Unity, Guénon elaborates on the consequences of the modern world's increasing emphasis on quantity over quality, portraying uniformity not as a form of unity, but as its inverse and destructive caricature. He posits that this shift is an inherent part of the cyclical descent of manifestation away from its essential principle. Guénon begins by explaining that as beings in the domain of manifestation progressively move away from principial unity, they become less qualitative and more quantitative. This principial unity, the essential pole, synthetically contains all qualitative determinations. Its opposite, the substantial pole, is pure quantity, characterized by indefinite atomic multiplicity, where elements are distinguished only numerically, excluding all qualitative distinction. He illustrates this with a geometric analogy of a triangle, where the apex represents the essential pole, pure quality, and the base, composed of multiple points, symbolizes the substantial pole, pure quantity. As one moves from the apex towards the base, the quantitative aspect becomes more pronounced. This base, representing pure quantity, is an unattainable limit beneath all manifested existence. He highlights Leibniz's principle of indiscernibles, which states that no two beings can be absolutely identical. There must always be some qualitative difference between them. From this, Guénon argues that uniformity in its pursuit necessitates beings deprived of all qualities and reduced to simple numerical units, a state that is never fully realizable within existence. The efforts to achieve it, particularly in the human domain, result in individuals becoming as nearly as possible like mere machines. Guénon asserts that this uniformization is not genuine unification, but its exact opposite, a caricature of unity. Quantity, he states, can only separate, leading to antagonism among fragmentary units that are antithetical to true unity. This drive towards uniformity is evident in democratic and egalitarian ideologies, which falsely assume all individuals are equivalent. Modern education, for instance, seeks to impose a uniform standard, which, while unable to confer qualities, is very well fitted to suppress in everyone all possibilities above the common level. Similarly, modern industry, with its mass production of interchangeable numerical units, perfectly embodies this triumph of quantity, sacrificing quality in its products and reducing human workers to entirely mechanical activity. This global imposition of uniformity by the modern West paradoxically makes the world less unified in the real sense of the word, and instead accentuates separativity. This caricature of unity is seen as an inverted reflection of true unity in the units of pure quantity, forming a topsy-turvy ideal. Finally, Guénon connects this triumph of quantity to a qualitative diminution of the cosmic environment itself. He argues that the success of modern man's artificial modifications of the world through quantitative science and industry is only possible because the terrestrial environment has been predisposed to such action by cosmic conditions of the cyclic period. This implies a real modification, where the environment becomes more amenable to quantitative understanding and manipulation. This qualitative diminution in the world corresponds to the increased emphasis on quantity in human beings, rendering them scarcely more than a body without a soul, largely devoid of their essential qualitative aspect, nama, and reduced to their substantial aspect, rupa. He describes this as becoming anonymous in an inferior sense, lost in the confusion of quantitative multiplicity, which is an inverse reflection of fusion in principial unity. This trajectory, driving individuals towards a state akin to quality-deprived atoms, represents a descent towards dissolution. In Chapter 8, Ancient Crafts and Modern Industry, Guénon meticulously contrasts two fundamentally different approaches to human activity, presenting modern industry as a stark manifestation of the prevailing reign of quantity and a profound decadence from the qualitative essence of traditional crafts. This chapter serves as a practical application and extension of the concepts of quality versus quantity and uniformity versus unity explored in previous discussions. Guénon begins by highlighting that the very distinction between arts and crafts, or artist and artisan, is a specifically modern phenomenon, indicative of a deviation and degeneration from a unified traditional conception. In ancient civilizations, the artifex, the one who practiced an art or craft, was seen as operating from principles of a much more profound order. His activity was not merely a practical skill, but was integrated with the tradition, and thus possessed a truly sacred and ritual character. Guénon cites the axiom ars sine scientia nihil, art is nothing without science, to emphasize that this science was traditional knowledge, not modern science. In such a traditional framework, every occupation is a priesthood, signifying that human activity was intrinsically linked to and derived from higher principles. A core concept in understanding traditional crafts is svadharma, the qualitative notion that every being should engage in an activity conforming to its own particular essence or nature, thereby aligning with universal order, rita. This meant that individuals fulfilled functions for which they were naturally destined by their inherent aptitudes. True traditional teaching, unlike profane instruction that focuses on accumulating a quantity of the notions learned from the outside, aimed at an awakening of the latent possibilities within a being, akin to Platonic reminiscence. When an artisan, through initiatic knowledge, fully realized the principles of their craft, their work became an adequate expression of their interior nature, resulting in a true masterpiece. In stark opposition, modern industry epitomizes the triumph of quantity. Guénon argues that modern conceptions disregard the essential qualities of beings, and instead view individuals as interchangeable and purely numerical units. This leads to a wholly mechanical activity in which there remains nothing truly human. The industrial worker, reduced to a servant of the machine, becomes machine-like themselves, engaged in activity that no longer implies the application of genuinely human qualities. Modern mass production aims to create the greatest possible quantity of objects, and of objects as exactly alike as possible, designed for individuals who are themselves presumed to be equally alike. This drive towards uniformity extends to living spaces, with people expected to reside in hives or living machines, further eradicating qualitative differences from their environment. Guénon concludes that the contrast between these two modes of production reveals an abyss that separates the normal from the modern civilization. What the majority celebrates as progress is, in his view, a profound decadence, continuously accelerating, which is dragging humanity toward the pit where pure quantity reigns. Modern industry, by imposing uniformity and sacrificing quality, not only fails to offer any possibility of an initiatic kind, but actively creates obstacles to the development of all spirituality. This industrial profanization strips human existence of its sacred and traditional character, reducing it to the third-rate mediocrity of ordinary life. In Chapter 9, The Twofold Significance of Anonymity, Guénon delves into a crucial distinction that further illuminates his critique of the modern world's reign of quantity. He explores how anonymity, a seemingly singular concept, manifests in two fundamentally opposite ways: a superior, traditional form rooted in spiritual realization, and an inferior, modern form born of quantitative reduction and spiritual decadence. This chapter provides a compelling application of the principles of quality versus quantity and uniformity versus unity to human activity and identity. Guénon begins by noting that traditional art, such as that of the Middle Ages, is often anonymous. Far from implying a lack of individual recognition or a mere oversight of history, this anonymity stems from profound spiritual principles. In traditional civilizations, the artifacts, the practitioner of an art or craft, operated from principles of a much more profound order. Their activity was deeply integrated with the tradition and possessed a truly sacred and ritual character, often seen as a form of priesthood. Traditional anonymity signifies a release from the limiting conditions of individuality, a transcendence beyond the determinations of name and form, namarupa. The individual's ego effectively effaced itself and disappeared completely before the self. The activity itself was an awakening of latent possibilities within the being, an outward expression of their true interior nature. When the craftsman, through initiatic knowledge, fully realized the principles of their craft, their work became an adequate expression of their interior nature, resulting in a masterpiece. This form of anonymity is therefore a suprahuman phenomenon, reflecting a profound conformity to cosmic order, Rita, where the individual functions not as such and such a person, but as an embodiment of a specific, divinely ordained function. Even in craft initiations, the profane or exterior individuality of the person would disappear in connection with their craft. This higher anonymity represents a fusion in principial unity. In stark contrast, modern anonymity, as exemplified by the products and processes of modern industry, is fundamentally infrahuman and operates on exactly contrary reasons. The industrial worker, in the context of mass production, cannot imbue their work with anything of themselves. Their role is purely mechanical, a mere servant of the machine. Consequently, the product expresses nothing of himself and is not really his work. The worker becomes a mere numerical unit, who is interchangeable with any other, devoid of inherent qualities in their work. This system prioritizes the greatest possible quantity of objects that are as exactly alike as possible, designed for individuals who are themselves presumed to be equally alike. Guénon argues that this industrial approach signifies the triumph of quantity and the triumph of uniformity. The individual in such conditions is reduced to his substantial aspect, called rupa in Hindu doctrine, becoming little more than a body without a soul. The qualitative or essential aspect, nama, is effectively stripped away, leaving an individual with no name that belongs to him, an anonymity in the inferior sense of the word. This is the anonymity of the masses, where the individual loses himself in a confusion of quantitative multiplicity, a sinister and satanic parody of their fusion in unity. The distinction between these two forms of anonymity powerfully underscores Guénon's overarching argument about the modern world's decadence. The inversion of analogy is clearly demonstrated. While traditional anonymity represents an ascent towards unity and spiritual realization through the effacement of the individual ego, modern anonymity signifies a descent towards fragmentation and qualitative diminution, reducing human beings to their lowest, purely quantitative aspect within a system geared towards soulless uniformity. Modern industry, therefore, is not merely a different mode of production, it is a profound manifestation of the anti-traditional spirit, actively creating obstacles to the development of all spirituality and substituting a superficial mechanistic homogenization for genuine, qualitative unity. In Chapter 10, The Illusion of Statistics, Guénon extends his critique of the modern world's reign of quantity by dissecting the flawed methodology and inherent deceptiveness of statistics. This chapter firmly establishes statistics as a primary manifestation of the modern scientific mentality's obsession with numerical quantification, revealing its fundamental inability to grasp essential qualitative truths and its role in perpetuating a diluted understanding of reality. Guénon argues that a defining characteristic of modern science is its insistence on reducing everything to quantity, considering anything that cannot be put into figures as lacking scientific value and being more or less non-existent. This quantitative imperative leads modern inquiry to lose touch with everything that is truly essential and renders it incapable of explaining anything whatever. The very foundation of statistics, therefore, rests on a profound self-delusion about what can genuinely be deduced from mere numerical evaluations. A significant aspect of this illusion is the modern scientific pseudo-principle that the same causes always produce the same effects. Guénon dismisses this as inherently absurd, contending that while causes and effects may be similarly comparable, there are always inevitably differences, because no two things are ever truly identical. This pursuit of sameness ties directly into the modern world's drive for uniformity, where individuals and objects are viewed as simple numerical units. This echoes the infrahuman anonymity discussed in Chapter 9, where the industrial worker, for instance, is reduced to an interchangeable unit whose product expresses nothing of himself. Just as a true unity is not the uniformity of beings denuded of all their qualities, modern science's pursuit of uniformity overlooks the irreducible qualitative distinctions inherent in existence. Furthermore, Guénon critiques the empirical nature of modern science, particularly in its reliance on accumulating a large number of facts to prove a theory. He points out the fallacy that such an accumulation can only yield probability, not certitude, as facts are indefinite in multitude and can often fit several different theories equally well. This contrasts sharply with traditional science, which started from principles and not from experimental observations. Modern science's empiricism is deemed very far from being integral because it consciously neglects or sets aside a considerable part of the evidence of experience, specifically that which possesses a specifically qualitative character. Consequently, modern theories often have the least relation to reality, instead substituting conventions that are as arbitrary as possible. The fallacious character of these statistics becomes most starkly apparent when applied to the human order, which, in Guénon's view, contains the most significant qualitative elements. Statistics, by attempting to count facts presumed exactly alike, inevitably represent a deformation of the truth, especially when dealing with complex qualitative aspects. This is often driven by an excessive simplification, which accompanies the reduction to quantity, as nothing can be simpler than quantity. This process ultimately aims to strip beings of all their distinctive qualities, reducing them to a maximum of simplicity that can only belong to pure quantity. In conclusion, Chapter 10 reveals statistics as a prime example of the illusion at the heart of the modern scientific endeavor. By seeking to quantify all things and impose an artificial uniformity, this approach fundamentally distorts reality, overlooks essential qualitative differences, and provides a pseudo-mathematical veneer of exactitude. This illusion of statistics is not merely an error, but a symptom of the profound intellectual and spiritual decadence that characterizes the reign of quantity, actively obscuring true understanding and leading humanity further away from genuine unity.